Legal objection, Your Honor, it assumes a fact, not an evidence. Overruled. Mr. Siegel then said it would just mean that they didn't have a video. I then said overruled, no speaking objection, overruled. And then you said, Your Honor, can the jury? And I said, no editorializing by anybody. Ask another question, Mr. Persloman.
Your Honor, that was a comment that conveyed to the jury that there was potentially video that they didn't have. It's not just a speaking objection. Courts basically sustain the objection, and what it is...
No, I said overruled.
Whether it's...
All right, so what is it that you want? You are focusing on minutia.
Judge, what I want is I want the unethical conduct to stop.
Stop. Both of you knock it off.
Talking about from day one, Judge. I mean, that's...
Knock it off. Enough. Stop, Mr. Lewis.
What are we going to do, Judge?
The objection was overruled. You're focusing on minutia.
You mean a speaking objection where you worked out something for the jury?
What do you want me to do? Tell me what you want me to do.
Well, Judge, you've instructed repeatedly that there's a difference between a speaking objection when you're trying to even communicate a legal reason. That's not even a legal reason. That's basically shouting out a fact to the jury. It is, Your Honor, we've had in this case time after time after time, and what happens is unfortunately the conduct doesn't result in any consequence. So, Your Honor, again, what I asked at the time was I just wanted the court to, when the comment was made, I wanted the court to say to the jury that comment should not be made and you're disregarded.
No, I'm not going to do that.
Well,
I'm not going to do it.
All right.
Both sides have been making speaking objections.
Judge, we have not one time in this case, both sides at points have made speaking objections where they've tried to clarify a point of law or say, here's why the question. We have not one time made a comment like that regarding evidence. And we're not in a vacuum, as the court is aware from conversations that have been had. I'm not making this point in a vacuum. The court knows exactly what I'm talking about, and so does the defense. And there's a point where we just had it. It's not right.
The jury's going to be told that a question by an attorney is not relevant. It only applies meaning to the answer. There was no answer to the question. This is minutia. This doesn't amount to anything. I don't want to take any more time about this. The jury is waiting outside. The jury can come in.
I do. Could you please take a seat on the witness stand there? Thank you. Please state and spell your name for the record.
My name is Fadil. First name Fadil. Last name Biramah.
Thank you. Sir, will you tell the jury who you work for?
Yes, for the Los Angeles Police Department Forensic Science Division.
Idea of what your job duties entail working when you work in the firearm analysis unit.
So a criminalist in the firearms unit, we are primarily trained to perform work within the laboratory. That's where we spend most of our time. We perform the analysis of firearms and firearm-related evidence. This is the type of analysis that's commonly referred to as ballistic comparison. We call it firearm identification. In addition to this, we respond to the field in order to process crime scenes, particularly shooting scenes and officer-involved shootings are our main field obligations. We generate reports regarding these analyses and testify about them in court. Firearms, which actually fire live cartridges or ammunition, during the discharge process, they will actually cause marks to be impressed onto those ammunition components. So this is a large part of our responsibilities, is to perform the microscopic comparison of fired ammunition components. These could be bullets or cartridge cases, with the aim of determining what types of firearms they might be compatible with, or actually continuing to determine whether two items have been fired in the same firearm or were eliminated as having been fired in the same firearm.
I believe we left off, you mentioned that in this case specifically, you were asked to conduct what's called a type and caliber analysis of two fired cartridge cases that you looked at in the lab. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes. Firearm identification, what most people would call ballistic comparison, is really a subset of tool mark comparison, in which that tool is actually a firearm. When we say that a gun is semi-automatic, that specifically means that every time you pull the trigger, one cartridge is fired. It's going to function like a Windex bottle. I can hold the trigger all day, no more ammunition is going to be expended. So that is semi-automatic, as opposed to full automatic would function like an aerosol can. I hold the trigger and it will continue firing until the source of ammunition is depleted. It's going to pull that cartridge case out of the chamber rearward from the barrel. It's going to hit another implement called the ejector. At that point, it's going to be flipped out of the gun. It essentially will appear like if you flipped a quarter as hard as you could towards your right shoulder. Rather than having a magazine and a single chamber, there's a part called a cylinder. This is a cylindrical component that can be loaded with a number of cartridges. That component will then be rotated, bringing each cartridge in line with the barrel one by one, so that each can be fired. After that cartridge is fired, the cartridge case in a revolver will remain in the chamber of that cylinder until it is manually extracted and ejected from the gun. 35,000 pounds per square inch. These are acting on surfaces of the cartridge case, which are not much harder or much different than you might find in the soda can. This allows just huge amounts of information to be imprinted into the material of the cartridge case, allowing type and caliber determinations to occur, giving it a job.
If you hypothetically had received a gun in this case to compare to the two fired cartridge cases, could you determine scientifically if that particular gun that was provided to you was the one that fired these cartridge cases?
I could perform a side-by-side microscopic comparison on a comparison microscope. If the marks are of sufficient quality, it may allow me to come to the opinion that, yes, the reason for the agreement of those marks is I'm of the opinion that they were fired in the same gun. Conversely, it could lead us to the opinion that they were not fired in the same gun.
That was my next question, was if you were provided, hypothetically, if you were provided a gun to compare to two fired cartridge cases, you could also definitively say, looking at these individual marks, that that gun was not used to fire those cartridge cases. Is that what you're saying? Is that correct?
Yes. There's identification, same gun. Elimination, they were not fired in the same gun. If there's any deficiencies with the items, we can just say inconclusive, meaning I can't give you any definitive opinion.
Okay. And that's if you have a gun. But if you don't have a gun, what are you looking at? In a case like this, or what you would call a no gun.
Right. So you can perform that comparison with two cartridge cases collected in the same area. But again, it does not tend to give you much additional information. What we will tend to do, if you just had two items collected at a crime scene, for instance, is perform what's called a type and caliber determination. So here we would be trying to characterize or describe types of guns which we know to produce marks, such as those that we see on the evidence. Yes, their external features match the features that I documented. And there are also engravings on the inside of the actual cartridge case. When I receive evidence, I will engrave it with the item number, portion of that ER number, my initials, and serial number inside the mouth of the case where it will not obscure your marks.
You used to kind of determine how big the pool was of potential candidates to compare to those three features without a trial.
Correct. I'm just looking for a list of suspect guns, if you will, brands which we know to include just that one feature, the teardrop-shaped firing pin aperture.
Okay. So specific to the firing pin aperture.
Correct.
All right, let's move on. What was the next step you took?
The next resource I used is called the Class Characteristics Matrix. This is a developing database, also operated by APTI. It allows me to just, you may enter different features, such as caliber and firing pin aperture shape. I did so in order to try to broaden that list of potential makes known to the community to produce teardrop-shaped firing pin apertures.
Okay. After looking at those resources, what did you determine was the potential list of firearm manufacturers that could have contributed to that aperture shape?
Right. So from all the manufacturers operating, the list that is known to me as a result of consulting these sources comes down to just a list of about 5 different manufacturers. So we've narrowed that candidate group considerably just using that one feature. These images there are logos or images depicting those 5 sources.
Okay, so you went from 9mm, very common source, to now whittling it down to 5 manufacturers, just with the aperture shape, correct?
That's right.
Okay. If you would talk about the kind of next step in your research project.
So moving from the aperture now to the actual firing pin. At this point, it becomes a little more challenging because the firing pin that I'm looking at in this case just happens to be quite distinctive. Fortunately, several months before the occurrence date of this case, I initiated a project where I collected samples from firearms that were coming through the firearm unit. We regularly test fire pistols that come into LAPD custody to be entered into the NIVEN database. I collected 229 different firearms examples, and these are specifically what we call ghost guns. It's a new sort of phenomena of firearms. By examining the samples from those this sample set, I was able to locate a few species that actually exhibited the firing pin consistent with the one that I observed in this case.
The teardrop shape, correct?
Teardrop-shaped firing pin, correct.
Okay. And when you add that class characteristic to your analysis, so now you've gone from caliber, you've narrowed some out with the aperture shape, and now you've added in those that have the same aperture shape and this unique firing pin shape, what were you left with?
Right, so I'm left with the logo there you see on the left is not an actual manufacturer, it's just representing what we call ghost guns. So there's one particular aftermarket slide which is common to a particular frame size of ghost gun. That particular product exhibited the firing pin shape that I observed on the evidence. It also has some compatibility with frames that are produced by Glock. We have a similar database in firearm identification. This is called NIVEN, National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. So when we have a group of evidence cartridge cases, such as the ones in this case, we can enter it into the system and attempt to look for potential matches among tens of thousands of candidates that are in that system. At the conclusion of my examination, I took the actual items that were previously imaged into the NIVEN system and had them correlated again This means those images of our evidence were searched against the database again in order to see if I could find any other makes of firearms depicting that particular firing pin shape. Right, so the ghost gun species uses a frame. That is the portion you're going to grip. This is the part that needs to be serialized and controlled if it is manufactured and shipped to you, the consumer. Ghost guns use a product that is an incomplete frame. It requires you as the consumer to make just a few adjustments, drill a few holes in order to make that frame operational. You can order these over the internet. You can also order what's depicted there. The frame here is in that pink color. You're also going to need the other firing components, such as the slide and the barrel. These can also be ordered online. Then, using simple hand tools, as most of us would have in our garage, these aftermarket parts can be assembled and to produce a functional gun. Now, this gun does not have a serial number in that state, because when it was shipped, when the frame was shipped from that manufacturer, it was shipped in an unfinished condition, which did not require it to have a serial number. This is where the term ghost gun, I think, has taken hold, because it does not have that serial number that's known to law enforcement. The markings I found on these evidence items can be linked to a particular aftermarket slide. This particular aftermarket slide is known to be compatible with a few models of firearm frames. These include the Glock 43, 43X, the left-hand side that's depicted by that dark black colored frame. On the right-hand side, the pink frame is representing the ghost gun equivalents of that Glock frame, which may be marketed as the SS80 or PF9SS.
In your explanation just now, you said the evidence items that you examined. Are you talking about these cartridge cases that were item 1 that exhibit People's 32?
That's correct.
Okay. And you're saying that the class characteristics that you saw on these cartridge cases, those 3 characteristics, that it was 9mm, that it had a teardrop-shaped aperture, and a teardrop-shaped firing pin impression, those are the characteristics you were using to narrow it down to these 4 types of firearms?
Yes, that grouping of class characteristics is known to me through those resources. I've only been able to associate it with this one particular aftermarket slide. And this aftermarket slide is compatible just with a few styles of guns. The known brands and models are listed there.
Those 4, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Final conclusion, what you're not going to find in the report, I cannot say this configuration only comes from brand X. What we know is that after some considerable research, I can give you the list of candidates that we know to be consistent with these items. While these are consistent, we cannot really say that these are the only ones which will ever be manufactured with those general features. Due to that, the qualifying term, but not limited to, always appears in type and caliber findings, such as the ones I've produced here. Relatively considerable evidence.
But you don't limit it to just those 4 firearms, fair to say?
Correct. You can't state that it's those 4 and only those 4, because these class characteristics are voluntarily chosen by the manufacturers. They can change. It's also possible that there are other items out there that we have not run into. Any research material I use is finite. So for that reason, we include that qualifying mark to be overt.
But after your research in this area, you narrowed it to 4 that you, those 4 different firearms or that only that you could find that had those three class characteristics among them? Correct.
Objection has an answer.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Your Honor. That's correct. I'm only aware of the aftermarket product that's compatible with those four models.
Okay.
Are you aware that your report was only provided to Defense Counsel, meaning us, 2 weeks ago on January 23rd of this year?
Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant.
Sustained.
Let me ask you this then. When did you provide your report to either the detectives or prosecutors in this case?
Once it was signed off, I would email it to the requesting officer, so that should have occurred in January of last year. I don't know the date that I actually emailed.
Okay. Would it have been signed off on by, let me see if I see the name here, someone with the name, last name Harbison?
Correct.
And who is that?
This is another Crim 3 in the Criminalist 3 in the Firearm Analysis.
And what's that person's full name?
Amanda Harbison.
By Mr. Herzlomic on direct. If you evaluated any actual guns in this case, and you said, no, you did not do that. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. You also did not examine those two shell casings to specifically determine if they would discharge from any particular magazine. Is that right?
The cartridge cases
Yes.
were not compared for cycling marks to a particular magazine. That's correct.
Okay. And as a criminalist, you're certainly aware that there is, you made a reference to this now, a forensic evaluation available to determine whether shell casings were fired from a specific magazine. Is that right?
They aren't fired from a magazine. So what we're talking about is a cycling mark. This means just basically based on the fact that a live round can be pushed through the magazine into the gun. It's possible for marks to be distributed onto it without the discharge pressures, but it's not a typical examination that we do on a daily basis.
Right.
Your Honor, I'd like to lodge an objection if you could approach.
No. Your Honor,
It just goes to
state
a floor
the
two.
objection.
It goes to a 402 of the court previously ordered.
You can't say it in open court, Your Honor. We need to know it's
Yeah, this, we did cover this, so this is off limits. I do recall now, this is off limits. No.
Let me continue.
No.
So, in firearms analysis, class characteristics are general features shared by a group of firearms which are used to try to narrow down possible firearms that could have possibly fired a bullet. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. And those class characteristics do not identify a specific gun. Is that right?
Correct, as the name sort of implies. They indicate a class, a group of guns that may share a particular feature.
Right. And in contrast, individual characteristics, why don't you tell us, what are individual characteristics?
So individual characteristics are unintentional flaws that actually are created when the firearm is manufactured. Also, as it wears or corrodes over time. These microscopic flaws are pretty amazing because we can actually take guns off the assembly line and distinguish marks from guns even when they're manufactured one after the other. So these are individual characteristics that we would use in a traditional, I guess, microscopic comparison.
Thank you. So based on that, then, is it correct to say that class characteristics place an item within a category, general category, while individual characteristics can uniquely identify a specific item? Is that right?
That is how we intend to use them. Yes, the individual characteristics can be used to form an opinion of common origin, meaning that the examiner has determined it's their opinion. They agree because they were fired in the same gun.
Right. Try to narrow down the possible firearms that could have possibly fired these two shell cases. Is that right?
We're looking for evidence of known guns that produce similar marks, and we attempt to produce that list because it can be advantageous.
Advantageous how?
It can eliminate whole groups of guns, especially calibers. There's, as I testified, there's a great number of calibers out there. We can immediately sort of push those off the table as potential sources. At the same time, we can generate a list that may be of interest should a gun of that make come across an investigator's desk. It should sort of let them know that it's possibly useful to pursue additional examination in the laboratory.
And what you just said was that you do this examination to eliminate, your words, potential sources for the cartridges, right?
The class characteristics
Yes.
will eliminate a great deal of sources out there. Even our most common set of class characteristics
Right.
are still eliminating huge numbers of guns.
Sure.
The frames don't create the characteristics. So the frames are compatible with the slides, which I know to be consistent with the characteristics.
Appreciate you saying that. Thank you for clearing that up. And to be clear then, you're not comparing the characteristics with firearms themselves. It's the aftermarket firearm slides that you're using for comparison purposes. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, one more time.
Sure. You're looking at these class characteristics and determining that they are consistent not with actual firearms themselves, but with the particular part of the firearm, the aftermarket firearm slide. Is that right?
The slide of the gun is where these marks originate.
Right.
So that's what we can associate or evaluate.
Right. I think you just clarified, not the frame itself, but the slide that goes on top of the frame.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
All right. Is it fair to say that this process that you talked about, looking at firing pin apertures, firing pin impressions, and determining whether they look like, in this case, teardrops or D shapes or semicircles, it involves some level of subjectivity?
Yes.
Right. And in fact, that's why sometimes multiple people have to make determinations regarding how a firing pin impression or firing pin aperture should be characterized, right?
No.
No. Okay. So in determining whether or not, you just said this, determining whether the firing pin impression or the aperture looks like one type of shape or another, if it fits into a hemisphere, I think that's one type of D shape, one type of firing pin aperture, right? Hemisphere, is that one?
Hemispherical is the more accurate term for something I just called round.
Round. Okay. Is there a semi-hemisphere?
I don't know that term. No, there's one that is sort of a modified hemispherical shape that has sort of a beveled edge on one side, but it's not really called semi-hemispherical. It's been referred to as a D-shaped firing pin.
Okay. But in making the assessment, I think you said this already, there is some level of subjectivity.
To looking at shapes?
No, to determining what the shape is, right? In other words, these firing pins aren't standardized, right? You have how many different manufacturers making these firing pins? They're not going to be one particular shape, right?
They all make firing pins, yes.
Right.
And they
Different shapes.
use a range of different shapes.
Right, essentially a broad range of shapes, right?
At least three.
Okay. And in making the assessment whether or not a firing pin is one shape or another, you said this already, there is some level of subjectivity to this, right?
Yes, to looking at shapes.
And in that regard, that level of subjectivity doesn't just apply to you, but to the people who enter information in the databases that you rely upon, right? When they're entering information into the computer system, the same level of subjectivity that would apply to you would apply to them, right?
Sure.
Okay. Sir, all right?
Not exactly. So the marks are known to come from particular size of aftermarket slide.
Mm-hmm.
That slide is compatible with these core frames that I know. That was what is meant by the report and notes.
But your report expressly states that the two shell casings exhibit characteristics typical of aftermarket slides for a series of subcompact pistol frames, including, the phrase we saw on the screen there, but not limited to the four that you identified, right?
Correct.
Okay. Obviously, certain firearm slides or class characteristics are not contained in your databases. They wouldn't be available for reference purposes, right?
Yes.
Right. In fact, you testified on direct that there are other possible items you didn't locate which are compatible with the shell cases, right?
There are other possible items.
Your words. Did you say that on direct?
I don't recall exactly, but there are, you're talking about candidate sources that use this style of class characteristics. Is that what the testimony was about?
It's your testimony. Can you tell me, or you don't recall?
I don't.
Okay. So, would you agree that there are other possible firearm slides or firearms?
Objection to the word possible, Your Honor, in the court's prior ruling.
Okay. Would you agree that there are other possible or potential, your words,
Potential is a better word.
fine, potential firearm slides or firearms that you did not locate which are compatible with the shell cases?
That's what I attempted to look for. I looked for them because they could be out there.
Right. Because you don't know how many different makes of aftermarket slides exist, you would know how many different makes of aftermarket slides specifically have a teardrop firing an aperture and a teardrop shaped firing. You couldn't know that, right?
Again, we treat it as an aggregate brand, okay, because we don't know who's actually making them. I try to cast a wide net and look at all the products I can get my hands on that they've made. I only was able to find one select species that was congruent with the evidence.
Right. Based on what you can get your hands on, right?
Based on the intake into the Los Angeles Police Department, as well as that database, which is constantly growing. Correct, the NIDA database.
Right.
It's constantly being fed.
Sure. And there's a reason that's still developing, right? Because you're looking for more information.
The developing one is the class characteristics matrix that is on the AFTI website.
How many firearms are there that are in existence right now, types of firearms, that are compatible with aftermarket slides with a teardrop firing pin aperture and a teardrop shaped firing pin? Can you give a definitive answer?
I can give an approximate based on my experience here in our flow of firearms into the LAPD. Is that sufficient?
You would give an approximate answer without knowing all the different types of aftermarket slides that exist? If you can give an approximate answer?
I can give an approximate based on how many in this group that we see relative to the total amount of guns that come into the unit.
Right. But those would be only the guns that are logged into your database. If they're not in there, you can't use them for reference purposes, right?
Those are guns that come through NIDA on a daily basis. So it is part of our daily business just to have these guns that are handguns will be input into the system every day.
You'd agree that teardrop firing pin aperture has also been found on a Taurus firearm, right?
Yes.
Right. Specifically the Taurus GX4, right?
Again, that model sounds correct. I can check my notes.
If you want, so it's clear, it's on page 8 of your report, if you want to see it.
Yes, I'll return to page 1 of my case package.
It's the fifth result on the page.
Yes, the Taurus model with the teardrop aperture that I'm aware of is a Model GX4.
Now, as you said, you observed on the two shell casings this teardrop-shaped firing pin impression. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you'd agree that the Glock 43 exhibits class characteristics which include a D-shaped firing pin impression, right?
Yes.
Likewise, the Glock 43X exhibits class characteristics which include a D-shaped firing pin impression, right?
The Glock manufactured slides. That's correct. They have a different shaped firing pin impression than the one that I observed.
Right. The teardrop shape is distinct from the D shape.
Yes, very much so.
So to be clear, the Glock 43 and the Glock 43X do not depict teardrop firing pin impressions that are even remotely similar to the shell casings that you examined. Is that right?
That's correct. It is the aftermarket slide, which is compatible with those two frames that you just listed.
Right. And not the Glock
That
43.
aftermarket slide does produce those models.
Right. But you didn't connect it to a Glock 43 or Glock 43X that you said are typically sold here in the United States, right?
That's correct. The standard manufactured Glocks
Right.
don't match.
Okay. So in other words, the shell casings you recover are inconsistent with the class characteristics of Glock 43 and Glock 43X firearms, right?
The slides manufactured by Glock and sold. That is the part that does not match. The slides that are aftermarket, which are consistent, are compatible. The Glock 43 and the Glock 43X.
And the slides that are sold by Glock for the 43 and 43X are not compatible, right? The Glocks themselves, I'm not talking about aftermarket slides. I'm talking about Glock. You go to the store, you want to buy a Glock that's sold from a Glock. Glock 43, Glock 43X. It's not your those shell casings did not come from a Glock 43 or 43X, did they?
They did not come from a slide that is manufactured by Glock,
That's what I'm asking.
such as I'm aware of.
Thank you.
When I say compatible, we are talking about the compatibility of a slide and the frame. So the
Right.
frame is manufactured by Glock, the slide manufactured by Glock, they're compatible, they can work together. The slide manufactured by Glock does not, however, produce these models.
In fact, in your collection of those 229 ghost guns, only 2 Glock Store model SS-80 samples exhibited both the teardrop firing pin aperture and the teardrop firing pin impression. Only 2 of them, right?
Yes, it's rare.
Yeah. 9mm shell casings. Could have been made at a firing range, right?
Yes, I don't know where they were discharged.
Thank you very much. I have nothing further.
Sir, have you seen the combination of class characteristics that you saw in this case from any gun that did not have an aftermarket slide?
No.
And I know you said it, but if you can answer, what size frame is it that slide would be compatible?
I've seen these marks from an aftermarket slide, which is compatible with a Glock 43, Glock 43X, as well as 2 ghost gun frames, the SS-80 and the PF9SS. These are the frames that I'm aware of.
Are those size frames, the size that's compatible with a 43 and 43X, are those common frames that you see in your lab?
They are relatively uncommon. Quality results in that subjective determination.
Was that a hard determination for you to make, to determine that the aperture impression on those fired cartridge cases was a teardrop shape?
No.
Was it a difficult determination for you to make to say that the shape of the firing pin impression on those fired cartridge cases was also a teardrop shape?
No.
Those were firearms that you observed had the teardrop aperture, correct?
That's correct.
But did those firearms also have the teardrop firing pin impression?
No. The firing pin on those firearms is drastically different.
So can you say that those guns could not have been the guns that fired these cartridge cases because the class characteristics do not match?
Okay, we don't perform a one-to-one elimination over just digital images. the class characteristics I see there, if I had those in the laboratory, they would constitute a elimination. They're not from the same source.
Because the shapes are totally different.
That's correct.
Okay. No.
I want to mention something to you. You heard Mr. Barima say that he did not do any analysis of the shell casings that were found, or Mr. Efron said he found. He didn't. Mr. Barima did not do an analysis of those casings to the magazine that was recovered at Mr. Mayer's house about 6 to 7 months later. For legal reasons that do not matter to you, about 2 weeks ago, I advised both sides that an analysis of the casings and the magazines need not be done.
Just at the end of that motion, the court did not say that therefore they are not judges.
No, I gave the what I wanted the jury to know. What did you want to say?
Your Honor, that the court, in the admonishment, where the court did not say at the end of it, it could not consider that not be test. In other words, you told the jury, I told either both parties that they couldn't test it. You didn't tell the jury, so you cannot consider that, etc. In other words, they got an explanation, but no admonition. They might, I'm not saying that they won't, on their own, decide that because the court said that they won't consider it. But there wasn't an admonition. That's all. I thought the court was admonished for it.
I'm sorry. What did you ask? What should have been told them?
So, no, just adding the last part of it. So you told them, at my instruction, that evidence was not to be tested. But they were not told the next part, which for that reason, you are not in any way considered that as a part of the evidence.
They've been told time and time again that their decision in this case can be based only on the evidence that is within the universe of this court. I don't think it was necessary to say that.
Your Honor, the last thing for us, we just want on the record, it's our understanding that the court has had us indicate who the next witness is going to be. We just want to have the defense indicate what the order of their witnesses are going to be as well.
I've already told them that.
Who's first on the record?
So you want on the record. So then don't answer me off the record if you want on the record.
Who's first?
Janelle Phillips.
Say again?
12.
That's 12?
Yes.
All right, and assuming we get through 12, then who would be after that?
Rule 11.
All right.
Judge,
I think
I
that'll do today.
I just say one thing. I mean, it's a constant barrage. You gave an admonition. You said, I told them 2 weeks ago not to test. That doesn't speak to the time before 2 weeks ago. So the jury can infer anything they want before the 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
So if they can infer, so an instruction that they can't infer.
Both sides are entitled to argue reasonable inferences from the evidence. All right. Does anybody have anything else before we recess?
No, sir.
Thank you. All right. Remember, folks, 10 o'clock.